Welcome, everybody, to our August National Call. It's great to see everybody, even though I don't see you, but it's great to have you all on the call this afternoon. Each month, our National Call focuses on a different topic on either climate change or environmental justice, and you'll hear a little more about our presenter and our guest tonight in just a minute. First, I would like to just take over some housekeeping issues. If you are not familiar with Zoom, hover your mouse over to the bottom of your screen and you will see several icons. You will be muted throughout the call, but we do encourage questions. Our presenter will do the presentation, and then after the call, after her presentation, we have time for Q&A. So if you have questions as we move forward, there's a Q&A box in there. Just click the Q&A box and type in your question. You can ask as many questions as you like. If you want to share some information with the other people on the call, or share some links or say hello, please do so in the chat box. But it'd be great if you actually use the Q&A box for questions, and we will, we're going to let you all be able to participate through the Q&A, and those questions will be answered towards the end of the call. So now I would like to introduce to you Marianne Krasny, who is one of our leaders, in ECA leaders from our education committee. And Marianne is going to tell you a little more about our topic and introduce our guest speaker tonight. So over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Jerry. So I'm Marianne Krasny, and I'm a professor at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And it's my privilege today to introduce one of our PhD students, Roberta Nilson. Roberta is a PhD student with a Center for Conservation Social Sciences in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell. She obtained her bachelor's degree in environmental science from Washington State University and a master's of public policy at Oregon State University. Before that, she served as a Peace Corps volunteer as an environmental educator in rural Nicaragua. And she's also co-authored a number of publications, including one that's called Personal Harm and Support for Climate Change Mitigation Policies, Evidence from 10 US Communities Impacted by Extreme Weather, which was published, or will be shortly published, in Global Environmental Change. She's also published in other journals, including Climatic Change. What she's going to be talking about today is a recent award that she received from the Cornell Center for the Study of Inequality that supports her research investigating linkages between large-scale solar development and inequality in New York State. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Roberta Nilson. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Just gonna get my screen share started here. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint slides now. So hello everyone, and thanks for being here tonight. I'm excited to share with you about my research on utility scale solar development here in New York. So New York is a state where a lot is happening in terms of renewable energy development. This image that I have on the screen here shows the state's goal for generation of 70% renewables by the year 2030. And so while I understand that folks joining us tonight are from all over the country, the hope is that this information will be interesting to all of you and maybe even provide some insights to things to consider about your own state's energy policies. It's also important to remember that New York is traditional land of Indigenous people, and members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy have been stewards of the land I will be talking about tonight for thousands of years. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. I wanted to forefront the acknowledgements also in this presentation and say thank you to all of you at Elders Climate Action, and of course everyone in the audience, and to Dr. Marianne Krasny for the invitation to speak. Also, as a PhD student, none of this would have been possible without the support of my academic advisors, the university and department, and of course the funding agencies which have provided some financial support for this work. So tonight, my goal is to share with you all about my ongoing research, and I will start by describing what I mean by utility scale solar development and explain why it's an important topic for folks across the country and globally. I will share some insights from what I've observed in public response to these developments in New York and describe some of the specifics of New York policy related to solar development. And finally, Marianne emphasized that this is an action-oriented group and asked that I identify some potential opportunities for engagement. So I have a few ideas in that regard, and I really look forward to the opportunity for the question and answer to discuss some of that with all of you. So let's get started with making sure that we're all on the same page about what is utility scale solar. So it's kind of easiest to start with what utility scale solar development is not. So it is not distributed solar, which is probably the type that more people are most familiar with. So distributed solar just means that this energy produced is primarily intended for local direct use. And there are two main categories of distributed. Probably don't need to explain to you all what residential rooftop solar panels are. But then there's also non-residential distributed solar, such as community projects. Here in New York, community projects use a subscription model, so folks can sign up through their utility. And the idea is, like shown in this image here, that a variety of households sign up and the panels that for the approximate energy use that they need are installed in kind of a group, preventing the need for each individual household to have their own system. However, utility scale solar is distinct from those types of solar, mainly in that it is primarily intended to be sold on the wholesale electric market. So often these projects are considerably larger than community scale, and rather immediately the power is converted to energy that can be transmitted on high voltage power lines. To give you a little bit better of idea of what these sort of projects might look like, this is just an example of a utility scale project. I think this one's down in North Carolina by Duke Energy. And kind of the lower end of the, a lot of the major facilities that I'll be talking about tonight might be about the size of 150 football fields. So 20 megawatts corresponds to approximately 150 acres of solar paneling. And as you can imagine, for facilities of large sizes like this, there's going to need to be more consideration of trade-offs with other land uses like wetlands or existing agriculture. And of course, there's going to be potentially some greater visual impact just on the landscape and increased concerns about decommissioning and recycling. So decommissioning referring to the kind of life cycle of the solar panels themselves, and then also the land. So what condition will the land be left in once the panels are no longer at their useful life, which general estimates I've seen between like 30 and 40 years. Of course, there's also pros. So big one being more bang for your buck, so to speak. And obviously these larger facilities can contribute more substantially to reducing reliance on fossil fuels. And generally they're a source of energy that can be generated anywhere the sun shines, right? To differing levels of efficiency. And they also can present an economic development opportunity where they're developed. And so nationwide, solar energy of all scales has really been growing. So this is a chart from the Solar Energy Industries Association dating back to 2005. And in some, you see the total of all solar development has been rising over the last years, but you can see here the light blue, so the kind of wedge on the top part represents the utility scale solar, and it's now making up approximately 2/3 of the share of the total solar market in the US. And so, yeah, the units being used here is the megawatt. Just to clarify that, it's a commonly used unit of measure of output of a power plant. So as an example, a typical coal plant is about 600 megawatts in size. And I mentioned one of the pros of utility scale solar is going to be the low economic cost. So this graph compares costs of installation of different types of solar systems. And you don't need to pay too much attention to the different colors here, but just the total cost, and it's showing estimates from Q4 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020 for these different types of solar that I've talked about. And what you noticed here most substantially is just that utility scale is the cheapest by far, coming in much cheaper than residential, and even so what they call the non-residential here are going to be projects like the community scale projects I mentioned. But utility scale and the fixed utility scale are coming in definitely the cheapest, the rotating being a little bit more, and that just refers to when the panels can have a mechanism to rotate with the sun. And so given this, it's not surprising that the fixed utility scale systems are dominating the solar market. It makes sense that without subsidies or other policies to promote distributed generation, that the market will tend to be driven towards the utility scale projects. And this relevance of policy can really be seen when you compare across different states. And so these two graphs on the top, you have installations in North Carolina. And you can see, again, these same colors being used, so the light blue being utility scale installations, and the yellow and the dark blue being those two types of distributed that I talked about. So you can see here that clearly Massachusetts has a different combination, a lot more of the distributed types of solar energy. And understand this is related to the policies that they've had to promote distributed solar with the Smart Solar program. Whereas in North Carolina, the state does have renewable energy goals, but they have not specifically promoted the distributed types. It is important to note here that North Carolina's scale is about double what it is in Massachusetts. So they are producing more solar energy. And so transition a little bit more to just about my work. So I came to Cornell about 2 years ago with the opportunity to complete research about the increased activity around large scale and utility scale solar energy systems. And by activity, I don't mean construction happening yet, but rather a lot of policy discussions and a whole lot of prospecting for solar in the state. And by prospecting, I mean mostly land agents actively seeking landowners to sign leases to be developed for eventual utility scale solar projects. They have to secure the land before they can propose the project and start the siting review. So they have to at least get the landowners that are willing. And so this, this increasing activity around solar development really ramped up around the time that New York banned fracking for natural gas. And some of my academic advisors and former students had been researching those transitions and the fracking ban at the time. And hearing about this new activity around utility scale solar, saw the opportunity for some research in this area, and that's we're able to bring me on as a PhD student on this. And so a little bit more of the New York context to set up my work. I mentioned earlier that New York has really ambitious renewable energy goals, and this pie chart just demonstrates how much more new renewables need to be developed to reach the 2030 target. So existing renewables currently in the state accommodate for about 26% of what the energy demand is expected to be in 2030. And so the state needs to develop a lot more renewables, and this is just for the 2030 target. The 2040 goal, so within 20 years, the idea would be that this whole pie chart would be renewables, right? And furthermore, nuclear power and hydroelectric dams, which currently contribute significantly to existing renewables, aren't expected to be developed in large capacity to meet these goals. Some of these details and regulations are still being worked out, but the expectation is that offshore wind, land-based wind, utility solar, distributed solar, and maybe some run-of-the-river hydro plants will be what's making up this need for renewables. And as I'll talk about tonight, utility scale solar is probably going to play a pretty big role in that based on what we've seen so far. And this graph helps demonstrate the proliferation of solar energy. So here, listing all the projects that have been proposed in the state. Again, these are proposed, not yet developed, but that have started the siting review process since 2012. And so what we've had proposed and undergoing siting review are wind and solar projects. And what's really interesting here is that you can see that prior to about 2017, each green circle represents a different facility proposal. And prior to about 2017, these were almost all winds. And then it's really shifted to what I'm calling the solar wave, in that more and more solar facilities have been proposed, and also some of increasing sizes. These projects, like I said, they're proposed, they don't yet have their permits to start construction. And so that's the process that they're in. And again, this map shows those same solar facilities that I just had on that prior chart, but where they're distributed throughout the state. And you can see that these are predominantly in upstate regions. So New Yorkers talk about upstate versus downstate New York. So there's New York City down here, and you can see the majority of these proposals are in the upstate region. Long Island does have a proposal to expand the existing large-scale facility they have there, but many more facilities, and the size of the bubble I have here corresponds to increasing size are being proposed in upstate. And I don't have the transmission line shown here, but if I did, you would see that these roughly correspond. They're fairly close to where existing transmission infrastructure is. And I added the Cornell emblem there over Tompkins County for where I'm speaking to you from tonight. And so I got started with this work about 2 years ago, and my intent from the beginning was to start in the fields, observing how people in communities in upstate New York were responding to these different proposed energy facilities. So this photo here is from one of the first public events I attended for one of these proposed facilities out in Western New York. It's an open house event. Some developers do something similar to this in all of these cases as one of the first steps of the siting process. And so you can see here they have some various information banners set up and some employees from the developer talking to folks. And so I started going to events like this and just chatting with people informally, getting a sense for how folks were reacting. And I've also been now attending some more webinars that public events aren't happening, reading a lot of newspaper articles, editorials, public comments, policy documents, and conducting key informant interviews. So as an example of that, over the last year, and some of the quotes that I'll share with you tonight have been from 14 town supervisor interviews from communities with proposed utility scale solar projects. So town supervisors just referring to the highest locally elected official in each of these towns. And first of all, I think it's really important to note that what I have observed has really been a broad spectrum of responses, ranging from strong opposition to strong support. And furthermore, try to add this graphic here to indicate that initially and at these kind of earlier stages, there's a lot of folks who are neutral, uncertain, or ambiguous. And over time, they may be drawn towards opposition or support, but we also expect there's probably quite a few folks who stay kind of in this middle category. And then, of course, in actually one of the projects that I was observing over the course of the time that I visited the community several times, an opposition group formed. And so you started to see things like this road sign here, of people indicating that they did not support the solar project, and see that versus this other image here is of a postcard that's turned in public comment. It's been turned in public comment by about 40 people, I think, indicating their support for a project. Also, so among the 14 town supervisors that I interviewed, just to give you another sense of how reactions are spread across the spectrum. At the time I spoke with these folks, I was able to identify that about 4 of them were indicating strong opposition to the project. about 5 were neutral or undecided, and about 5 were indicating their support. And so this next finding from my fieldwork is really a theme. It's a strong narrative that I've identified that folks are really using as they're explaining their perception of the utility scale solar projects. And so this is a theme of perceived energy colonialism. And this is a term that's been used by some European social scientists, Patel and Divine Wright, to describe some perceptions of folks to high voltage transmission lines. But I'm really seeing it here, hearing it here in New York as well, and how this comes out as an example in different people's comments is this idea that rural upstate New York is being forced to bear the burden of downstate energy demand. And so quotes such as these, like, it has to be in someone's backyard, I think it should be in the backyard of the people who are using it. Or just because there are not skyscrapers on Western rural New York land does not mean that land is vacant and unused. And what I think is really interesting, or perhaps will be surprising for some folks listening tonight, is that I've really heard comments like these much more frequently than anything like any sort of justifications related to climate change denial. And actually a lot of the people that I talk to, I never brought up climate change usually in conversations unless other folks brought it up, but often they would, just when I asked, told them what I was doing, the first thing that they would say to me was, I support renewable energy, but I'm not sure about this project for a variety of reasons, right? And also what's interesting is that this narrative is not just coming across in folks who are already really strongly opposed to certain projects. I really heard it also as well from folks who said, despite this, like, even though they thought that it was this downstate energy demand as a burden for their community, they still might be supportive of the project. But I think that just kind of demonstrates the prevalence of this kind of theme. But also I did identify some trends more at the community level in where I was noticing there were communities without organized opposition versus those with organized opposition. So by organized, I mean most likely that they've formed a local group that's expressed their opposition to a project. And so with some of the communities that hadn't happened, and I noticed that these communities tended to be more remote or have higher poverty levels or have few other economic opportunities. So as an example, this quote from one of those town supervisors, he said, "What we're looking at is the future for our community. Are there going to be any major industrial place going up or anything like that in the community? I can't foresee anything major like the solar people are proposing for a while." And so this was really the main way that he described to me why he supported the project in his community. Versus there were several other communities with really strong organized opposition, and these communities tended to be have higher education, income, and home values, have more commuters to nearby urban centers such as Rochester or Albany, and also had some potential tourism opportunities that they perceived to be threatened. And so, for example, one supervisor said, "We're not looking to sell our town, you know, the feeling, the ambience of our town for money. We are not desperate." And another said, again, kind of speaking to this, you know, that's not about climate change denial, he said, "Oh no, actually I have 7 grandchildren, so I really want renewable energy. It's just that I would really be in favor of the state building the infrastructure to bring the transmission out to where there's not so many people." And so he was perceiving that this project should be developed somewhere that was more remote. And again, these are a few kind of extreme examples on the end of these spectrums. So this wasn't everyone, but it was something that I noticed among multiple communities with opposition. Another interesting feature is some resistance to the terming of solar facilities, these utility scale solar facilities, as solar farms. So these photos here are from the open houses that I observed as well, that where the developer was really promoting this idea of solar grazing. And they even went so far as to bring live lambs to be greeters at one of the events. And opposition groups were really kind of responding to this by rejecting the use of the term farm to describe the facilities. So if you remember that road sign I showed earlier, it said no massive power plant. It didn't say no massive solar farm, because they're really rejecting this kind of characterization of these large scale facilities as farms. And so it's perhaps an interesting thing to know for anyone interested in advocacy around this. They wouldn't start the conversation with calling it a solar farm. I usually try to say facility just to maintain neutrality to the extent possible. And so now I'd like to shift into discussing a little bit more of the policy and implications of this work and other things that I've observed about New York State policy. And it's important to understand the larger context of socioeconomic inequality in which this development is happening. So as many of you are probably aware, national income inequality is rising throughout the state, has been on the rise for decades. However, contrary to what the energy colonial narrative may suggest, this inequality is not explained only by like a rural-urban divide. That was a trend in prior decades, but now it's not that urban areas are getting richer and richer while rural gets poorer, but that there is increasing income inequality within both rural and urban areas. And so this is important because when you consider the different demographics of the rural communities where these facilities are being proposed, you have here just two comparisons. So one town, Mount Morris, where household income is quite a bit lower, percent below the poverty line is dramatically higher than it is in the town of Cambria, and home values are significantly lower. And emphasizing home values in particular because the property taxes are the primary funding mechanism for local governments. And so you can imagine that a town like Mount Morris is going to potentially be under a lot more fiscal stress given the decreased property values they have. And so one concern is that in lower income communities who already have higher fiscal stress, they could be targeted for more low cost developments and may have less bargaining power in a competitive market system. So they also may be more willing to accept lower tax revenues from these facilities, and landowners in those areas may be offered lower rent rates, and things like environmental protections for sensitive habitat may be less likely to be enforced because those are all things that are going to increase project costs. And so this is a potential for a form of destructive competition, which could reinforce some of these existing inequalities. And I want to emphasize here that I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing that these facilities are developed in lower income communities. This isn't kind of as extreme of an environmental justice situation as installing a coal plant, but there are certain considerations that you want to take into account. And for a truly just transition, I think we would all want to see these communities receive fair compensation and not to be targeted for development or asked to accept lower rates just because they have struggling economies to start with. And so you may be wondering, is New York State policy designed to combat this potential reinforcement of inequality from the competitive market system? And so I wanted to talk specifically about the key mechanism that the state is using to promote major renewable energy facilities. And these are the Renewable Energy Standard procurements. So a procurement, we call them RES procurements. What these are is a negotiated contract between the utility and the energy developer for a 20-year fixed price. And so basically what this is it provides, if a given developer submits an application for the project and they're awarded this contract, and this is a process that's run by the state's energy authority, or NYSERDA, then they know that they have a fixed price for 20 years. So it really provides a lot of guarantee for these facilities to get developed. And these contracts are awarded annually by the state energy authority. And this process happens often before the facilities even start siting review. So they still do need to get constructed, but again, they're much more likely to be constructed, and the developers much more likely to continue developing them if they have one of these contracts. And this map shows the ones that were awarded in 2019, and the state's planning on really ramping up this system and awarding more in the coming years. There's a call out right now and in future years to meet the energy goals. And it's important to understand that these procurements are a market-based mechanism for supporting projects. And what I mean by that is that the way that they're evaluated is a point-based evaluation system in which bid price, so lowest price, is awarded the highest amount of points. And so it really dominates how these proposals are evaluated. So this emphasis on low price, you can see 70 points out of the possible 100 points for, so in each calendar year that projects are submitted, they all get assigned these different point values, and those with the highest amount of points then get awarded the contracts. And so bid price really emphasizes this, and this emphasis on low price could incentivize developers to pursue the lowest cost projects and could discourage certain mitigation or environmental protections, which would make the projects more costly. And what I noticed in particular that is lacking from this evaluation is any sort of assurance that these projects will promote economic justice. So for example, another factor that can increase project cost is local opposition, like the local opposition I was talking about before. And this current system could encourage developers to really pursue projects in those places with the least opposition, because opposition can be associated with lawsuits and a lot of time, and can increase the project costs. And so this is just kind of an idea, a really rough idea, but what if the proposal evaluation was able to include something that really emphasized economic justice? So maybe something like profit sharing or community ownership in low-income communities. Again, just kind of throwing that out there. This is not something that I've seen officially proposed, but just as an idea, there's a number of ways in which this kind of system could be shifted to encourage to disencourage the reinforcement of inequality, I guess I should say. So some of the good news is that state policies can be designed to reduce perpetuating inequality. So for example, in New York, the state is currently redesigning the facility siting process, and they've newly formed an office called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. And this office is tasked with creating uniform and standard conditions for the review of renewable energy facilities. And the terms of these conditions are supposed to be designed by April of next year. Currently, projects are moving forward just more on a case-by-case basis. But the idea is that these uniform and standard conditions will speed that up and provide some consistency. So it could be really meaningful if these type of conditions were able to emphasize economic justice. And I do know that the state has very recently formed the Just Transitions Working Group that was called for in some recent legislation. And so this group has just recently been established, and there's potential that work in this area could shape siting conditions or those procurement evaluations that I'm talking about. I haven't seen any for sure indication that this Just Transitions Working Group is going to work in the area of siting review that I've been talking about. And furthermore, with this formation of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, it has brought about or emphasized, I should say, a bit of a conflict because it continues this process where New York State is assuming the authority that was once allowed to local governments to be in charge of siting review of different facilities. And this is really not a popular thing in upstate New York, and I think you can imagine why, given the dominance of this energy colonialism idea that I talked about earlier. So folks saying things like, we'll be powerless against the state if it passes, and lo and behold, it passed. And so a fear that I have is that this kind of dynamic where the state has assumed control over the siting of these facilities in this context of already political divide that we have in New York, is that there could be some increased divide and division among these different communities as they perceive of the Office of Renewable Energy siting as a injustice of state authority. So about to finish up here, and I'm sorry, I feel like I've been speaking really fast because I've gone through this faster than when I practiced. But that does give me plenty of time to talk about some opportunities for engagement. So first of all, just wanted to emphasize some reference materials. So again, recognizing that not all of you are in New York, a great place to start to learn more about what's happening in your state around solar development is with the state-by-state map provided by the Solar Energy Industries Association. And so that's where I got those bar charts of Massachusetts and North Carolina, and showing the different distribution of the types of solar in each of those states. And it does provide some highlights of state policy as well. And then folks that I've worked with, we've been involved in some research and policy briefs. So those can be a resource as well. And I wanted to mention that at Cornell, as the land grant university, some of this work has been supported by the fact that we have the cooperative extension. So likely cooperative extension offices in your home state, maybe doing something around solar development happening there. And finally, the kind of more actionable recommended action item is really this opportunity to participate in public comments. And so in New York, each of these facilities I've been talking about, because they're under this centralized state review process, they have their own public comment period, public comment opportunity for each of the facilities. So this is an example here. And provided the links that I think Jen is planning on sharing with you all in the chat of where to find these different facilities, but you can see this is what the web page would look like. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can add your own public comment. But then I think more importantly is that there will be four public hearings on the state level uniform and standard conditions for siting review between now and April 2021. The idea, I think, initially with those was for there to actually be in-person public hearings. Haven't heard the details, but I can only imagine that these will be virtual opportunities coming up over the next year. And I also shared a link with that because they haven't released the details yet, but there is a listserv that can be joined to get notifications about things like that at the state level. And other states likely have really similar public comment opportunities. And a good first place to start is to figure out for these kind of larger facilities if your state has a local or a state level siting review, because that tells you where the public comment opportunities might be. So just to sum things up from what I've talked about, New York's energy goals have really opened the state up to significant utility scale solar development, and community responses that I've observed have really ranged from strong support to strong opposition, with a lot of folks in the middle. And this narrative of energy colonialism has been a more dominant framing or theme than something like climate change denial. Finally, I talked about some of the policy mechanisms and discussed how these market-based mechanisms could potentially perpetuate some existing inequalities. And I talked about policies that could counteract market forces to promote a more just transition. And with that, that's all I had prepared for you tonight. So I hope that there's some opportunity for some discussion and questions.
Great. So thank you, Roberta. That was really great, very informative. I really enjoyed your presentation. And we do have some questions from the chat and from the question answer. So I will read some of them to you.
Okay.
Ready? Okay. So this is from Leslie, who lives in Maryland, and she says, Maryland has utility scale solar that is being placed on old landfills by a company that takes subscriptions. The power is put directly on the grid, and the local power company gives you a credit for your proportion or your portion of the renewable power that you use each billing cycle. This seems to be working pretty well. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that sounds really great. I didn't have a chance to mention tonight that New York is also has some policies in place to try to specifically promote solar on those more brownfields, like old landfills, like that it sounds like you're describing. And so that's a great option. Again, it's gonna probably be a small part of the total renewable energy package that the state needs for their whole energy goals. So I'm not sure if there was another specific question in there, but it sounded like they're using also a subscription-based method for the utility scale project, which isn't something that I've heard discussed here in New York. There have been some communities that have specifically asked if there can be a stipulation to where their community would get solar power from these facilities or power at a lower rate. And that's something that the state hasn't yet regulated or put into place as a kind of requirement, but it definitely seems like a good idea.
Okay, great. So I think this is a related questions from Jeff, and he says, do you know of any initiatives to sweeten the proposal by combining solar with other combined uses of the same land, such as elevated panel supports with alternative land use below the panels, parking, plantations? You already mentioned grazing, but I don't know if you know the suite of combined land uses.
Yeah, so in New York and with the grazing, something that's interesting and that folks in the communities pointed out to me is that the grazing is this idea that's put forward in this public engagement period of the proposals, but from what I've seen, when the state is actually making decisions about whether or not the permit will be issued, combining other uses isn't something that they consider. They say that that's kind of separate, that they're getting the permit is about whether or not the project can be constructed. And we haven't seen them incorporate, strong requirements that solar grazing will actually happen. And so that's a concern that some people have, and something that I think should be clarified in policies across states, is whether or not when the developer proposes this idea to have solar grazing or pollination or some of these other things that you're mentioning, whether or not that's actually something that's required when the facility gets constructed. Because a related concern that many folks has is that a lot of times the developer that proposes the initial plan and gets folks signed up, often these projects can get sold to other companies as well. So some of those kind of different things that they talk about might not be guaranteed in when they're getting their permit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a question from Paul. It's kind of the opposite sort of tact, and that is, are there state policies around siting allowed around green fields so that result in forest loss? And I was just thinking the same thing when I went by that new plant out on Stevenson Road the other day, and I heard the lambs grazing. But I imagine I don't think it's been there more than a year or two. It used to be probably a cornfield or something. So are there concerns about agriculture or forest or natural lands being taken up by these facilities?
Definitely, yeah. And so the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York participates in siting review right now. And so especially with protecting things like wetlands, that's obviously a big consideration that happens. And then what gets tricky in the New York context is then when it's not on forest land or wetlands, then it's on farmland. And there's a lot of conflict about whether or not prime farmland should be used for large scale solar facilities. So there's always going to be these different trade-offs. And it's really a debate that's happening even between, the different state agencies like Department of Ag and Markets advocating for more farmland protection. And then that butts up against some of the existing protections of forest land. So yeah, again, these things are all what's happening and all some of the challenges that folks are dealing with. Say in New York, some of those policy briefs that I mentioned, we talk more specifically about the conflict with existing agricultural uses.
And Francis from Maryland asked, was there any discussion of agrivoltaics other than the sheep grazing?
So the solar honey is another thing. So just growing pollinator crops and potentially harvesting honey from that. Those are the two main things that I've heard about in New York. I'm not sure if what other options may be out there. I've heard that, like cattle, like some folks said, why not cattle? Why? Because there's a lot of like dairy farms in New York. And I understand that's more of a burden, harder to manage and make sure the cattle aren't disrupting any of the panels. But I'm not sure if I haven't heard about other types of ideas. And I should note that folks at Cornell are studying some of these options like the solar grazing and whether or not that's feasible and an economically viable opportunity, especially at these really large scales. So remember I mentioned that a 20 megawatt facility was about 150 acres. A lot of these proposals are upwards of 100 megawatts. So that's now up to, 1,000 acres or more. And this kind of use of agrivoltaics at that scale hasn't really been studied. So that's something that's kind of underway, but still uncertain how viable those sort of projects will be at this scale.
Okay, thank you. So this question is from Jeff, and he says, does the cost of utility scale solar include the cost of distribution?
So meaning the transmission lines and all of that. I don't think that graph that I had, I didn't create that. That was by a marketing firm from the Solar Energy Industries Association, but I don't think the cost of transmission was included in that, because it's kind of a separate, it's not a cost that the developer directly has to take on. Again, transmission upgrades are a whole nother separate process that the state is underway right now. And so that's not a cost that's expected to be borne by the developer. So I don't think it would be included in those costs that I shared.
Okay. And then Lisa was wondering, going back to one of those earlier slides about policy and types of solar in North Carolina versus Massachusetts. And I think we saw that North Carolina had so much more distributed, where Massachusetts was more, I guess, community and some residential. And I mean, maybe you can talk about North Carolina versus Massachusetts, but it just made me think maybe in general states have like really different, like why would be so different from one state to the next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had really more details for you, but yeah, I think you're something I want to look into more. But the idea is basically that, given the fact that very little is happening at the federal level in terms of solar, other than some subsidies, but then this decisions about how to reach different climate goals are really left up to individual states. And I understand that Massachusetts is really promoting the distributed types of solar a lot more. And but I haven't looked into if they're like discouraging the utility scale. And then my understanding, North Carolina is they're not specifically promoting distributed types. And so, but they do have renewable energy development goals, and they have a lot of opportunity for solar. And so, you know, I think Duke Energy is a big player there. And that was even the image that I showed of a utility scale project there. So it's really, that's all that kind of detail clarification I have right at the moment, but it's something I hope to look more into in the future.
Okay. I think this is kind of similar to before, but why not cover parking lots rather than arable land, from Jeff?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of scale and costs. I think the idea is that in theory, it needs to be all of the above to really meet New York's goals. Right now, I can tell you that it's cheaper to develop these things at kind of these economies of scale. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of activity. I should note that there's also a lot of distributed projects being developed in the state, but just when you look at the comparison of how much that's going to contribute to the overall state climate goals, it's just it's quite small compared to these larger scale projects. So New York does have a goal for about 5% or 5% of the total, like 100% energy demand that's needed by 2040, for about 5% of that to be met by more distributed solar projects. And we're talking about, you know, at least probably 20% from the utility. So really I focus mostly on the utility because it's more of a large land use issue in upstate New York, the region that I'm working in.
Okay, great. So there's a question again from Jeff. What is the possibility of using the batteries in parked EVs, electric vehicles, to feed the grid during peak electricity usage? And somebody else asked whether these, it was Jeff also, maybe asked whether, or no, I think it was a different Jeff, asked about whether their battery storage combined with these facilities.
Yeah, I'm glad someone asked that question, because I did have a slide on it that I wasn't able to, that I didn't include for time, because these new facilities are starting to, so am I sharing screen again, I hope? Mm-hmm. Yeah, new facilities, more and more of these proposals are starting to specifically include solar plus storage. They don't have a ton of details right now about what those storage facilities will be. As far as the first question about using batteries, like car batteries, I'm not an engineer. I haven't focused on that much, but I understand that helps, right? But then these larger scale facilities, they are starting to propose to install large batteries next to the substation where these facilities are developed. And so this bottom picture that's here shows, this is like this kind of grid area is like the substation, just to give you an idea of size. And then this yellow is what their initial plans, their proposal for where they would put this really large lithium ion battery storage component. And my understanding is that the idea is that would supply like about a 4-hour duration. So that allows the solar to help meet that peak demand that I think was mentioned in the question. So it could store 83 megawatts of capacity for up to about 4 hours. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And there's not a lot of details about these yet because they haven't really been employed at this scale. Even in the developer's proposal, they kind of said, this is our idea right now, but we're not quite sure. And that kind of irritates some folks too, especially like local fire departments who are wondering about safety and how they can be prepared to respond to any incidents at these things, which is another thing that I understand that folks are working on some trainings for issues like that.
Okay, so just a quick question from Jeff. Is there a low end limit on acreage below which a utility style permitting is not required?
Yes, well, not utility scale permitting, not worded exactly like that, but the state does have a limit. It recently changed. It's going to change with the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting. And in New York, it's that utility facilities below 20 megawatts are handled by the local siting review, and above 20 megawatts are the ones that then go to the centralized state office. So I'm not exactly sure if that's how he worded the question, but utility scale solar projects smaller than 20 megawatts are that permit review is handled at the local level in accordance with environmental laws. It's just not handled separately by the state siting office.
Thank you. And we have a question from Mildred Warner, who I think is actually right here at Cornell with us. And she says, great job, excellent presentation. What about taxes and/or community benefits from these developments?
Yeah, thanks, Mildred. Mildred's one of my committee members. And yes, I didn't have time to go into some of these details, but this is something that's, I think, is going to be also impacted by this this competitive market system, right? That these, the state has some recommendations for what pilots, by pilot, she means payments in lieu of taxes, because energy systems by state law or by state taxation law are exempt from being, for the added value of the energy system being taxed as a local property tax. And I did mention that local property taxes are the primary source of revenue for local governments. And so these systems, multi-million-dollar projects, by default are not taxed unless the local government opts out. And they can, however, negotiate a payment in lieu of taxes. And something that I think is lacking perhaps from state policy or hasn't been fully established yet is whether or not there's going to be any sort of regulation on the level of local taxes that local communities should get. So right now it's all following kind of this competitive system. I had a supervisor I spoke with a few weeks ago over email, and she told me what they've done. They've opted out of the tax exemption with the hope that the developer will either offer them a lot more money or they'll go away. And so that is definitely becoming an area where some competition is happening. And I think it's going to be critical to follow kind of how the state decides or not to regulate local taxation.
Okay, great. Well, it's just about 8 o'clock. So I think with the other questions, if it's okay with you, Roberta, we might try to send them to you. There's just a few more questions. There's a lot of comments about people enjoyed your presentation, but I just wanted to close with one question from me.
Okay.
You mentioned some of the concerns about equity not being included in the siting decisions, and then some other people mentioned about sort of other green uses of agricultural uses of land that you said also I don't think is included in the siting decision, so environmental issues. And so you mentioned also there's 4 hearings somehow coming up in New York. Do you anticipate either you personally or your research could have an input into some of the, maybe revising these siting decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks can provide input, in that ideally my hope is to produce some actionable recommendations. It's kind of a challenge, as you know, to navigate when you're kind of at this early stage of this research, this advocacy versus science kind of position that we find ourselves in. But yeah, my hope is that more folks that are interested in this just transitions framework will participate in public comment of these kind of really specific things that are happening right now, that really are how the state is planning to reach these ambitious energy goals that it has. And so yeah, I think it would be great to submit some comments in there. It's hard for me to submit them when I'm actually studying, also studying the public comments, but yeah, I hope so.
Or maybe some of the rest of us can have some input into New York or other states. So, well, thank you very much. We got a lot of nice comments in the chat and the questions about excellent presentation, including from some of our top leaders at ECA. So we really appreciate you preparing the presentation and spending the time to give it to us. And hopefully the discussion will continue. It's really stimulating and interesting. I learned a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry it got dark. I'm mostly on natural light here. I didn't want.
Yeah, get dark here in New York. Okay, so Jerry, were you gonna close out, or Jen with anything?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Roberta. That was fabulous. It really was interesting and had a lot of information that I for sure was not aware of. So it's good to know, and it's good to know how to better go about checking on solar in my own communities in my own state. But before we go, a couple of announcements. On Saturday, August 28th is our next shoe strike, and I'm hoping that we'll have even more participation by members and chapters than we did in July. And we had some good participation in July. So I think Jen may be able to put the link to that in the chat. Also, if you'd like your city to start declaring a climate emergency, you can join our partnership with Climate Mobilization and share ideas and strategies with other ECA members on how to start doing that. We've got a little group going on that. Also, please join our collaboration with the Environmental Voter Project, and which is working on Get Out the Vote. So that is ongoing and has been for a couple of years now. Our next call will be on September 24th. I hope you'll all put it in your calendars. It's going to enable you to learn about B corporations, which are both environmentally and socially responsible corporations. And yes, there are some out there, and you would be able to support those corporations if you learn more about it. So we'll have that presentation in September. And I hope that you'll continue to support us by attending our webinars, our climate tea and talks, looking at our newsletters, taking action, and also, if possible, make donations to Elders Climate Action. We count on all of you. So have a good evening. And Jen, did you have something you wanted to say?
I just want to say correction. It's the national call is on next month is September 22nd, and the shoe strike is on September 29th. Oh,
so I got as much wrong in dates as I possibly could. Those are the only 2 dates. So thank you, Jen. It's good to have somebody watching out for me. Thank Marianne for your great facilitation, and Roberta for your information. And I wish you luck with the rest of your research. Keep us posted on how you're going with that, and we'd be happy to hear more outcomes and more results of your work as you move along. So keep us posted. And yes, whoever's asking whether you can get a copy of the presentation, you will get that copy of the presentation when you receive the recording in a day or 2. So good night, everybody, and have a great week.